Who is known as the poet of the piano? Is it John Elton, Ray Charles, Thelonious Monk? None of these. The person who has gone down in history as the poet of the piano is Frédéric Chopin. I chose Chopin because a couple months ago I heard one of his pieces called a nocturne, and I hadn't heard it for such a long time, so I went and bought a whole packet of CDs because I like the music so well. Even today, in all walks of life, people find enjoyment and feel emotion when they listen to Chopin. If you haven't heard of Chopin, I'm going to play you something a little bit later on that I'm pretty sure that you're going to recognize. He lived only 39 years, from 1810 to 1849, with a life full of interesting people and interesting places where he went. And there are a few things that stand out that were very important to him. One was his country of Poland, his relationships, and his music. And I also want to, at the end, finish up with how he's impacted some of the pianists of our day and on some friends of mine that I contacted through social media. Chopin was born in Poland in 1810. When he was a few months old, his family moved to Warsaw, which at that time was known as the Duchy of Warsaw. And I think you might see that in the map, the Duchy of Warsaw. Throughout his lifespan, Chopin saw a lot of changes that occurred in his homeland of Poland. At this time in his life, it was a satellite of France. Remember, this is just after Napoleon, and a lot of changes were going on. There had been a Russian invasion, and part of it became Prussia. We'll see that the turmoil didn't stop at the time of his birth. It kept going on. And in 1830, Chopin gave his final concert in Poland, and he became an exile, along with many other notable people, some aristocrats, and many of them gathered in Paris at the time. In Adam Zamoyski's book, Chopin, Prince of the Romantics, he tells of one of Chopin's teachers that as he was leaving, he had assembled a small male choir and met Chopin at the city gates. They sang a cantata, and he told him to remember his motherland and to keep its harmonies in his soul wherever he might find himself. And when in Paris, he became acquainted with what was called the Polish Club, that Zamoyski said had a collection of old generals and scruffy young poets, because remember, this is the Romantic era. So we have, preponderance of musicians and poets and artists that are kind of congregating and gathering in Paris. And though he had some French blood, Chopin was a Pole to his core throughout his life, and his allegiance was always to Poland and to Polish causes, to which he gave generously when he was asked. Although he was never politically motivated, either in his actions or in his music, sometimes to the chagrin of those who were maybe a little bit more militant leaning. Chopin was one of those people who needed to have his friends near him. He made friends easily, but he wasn't one of those who had a lot of close friends. There were very few that he could really share himself with as close friends. For the women in his life, for example, he found one woman with whom he was to whom he was very attracted, Maria Wodzinska, and he decided finally, after a long period of time, that he wanted to marry her. She was agreeable, but her mother delayed and delayed. And we don't know if maybe she heard about what life was like in Paris and didn't expect that he was one of those boys who would come home to kind of settle down. But she never really agreed to this marriage. So after a year or so, the engagement sort of just languished and died. In 1836, his path crossed that of George Sand. Now, George Sand, whose name was Aurora Dupin, was a female French novelist who wore trousers. Now, in that day, that was quite the thing, and whose affairs were as well known as her novels. She was in the midst of all the artists in Paris because of this romantic movement. She was right in the thick of things. They didn't really think much of each other after that first encounter, but in 2 years, in 1838, they met again and fell in love. There's a couple pictures of Chopin in his younger years, and a picture when he was a little bit older. That was not too long before he passed. Another picture I'll show you of a drawing of him that is kind of interesting. Because the two of them fell in love, they were still artists and they needed their space. So they did keep enough room to do their work, but it was during this time that Chopin fell increasingly ill. She became his nurse as well as his companion. Although they did have times where they traveled a lot, they had friends in common, so most of those years seemed to go well. There's a picture of her when she was nursing him, probably 3 or 4 years before he died. It does seem, though, as Zamoyski suggests in his book, that she became more motherly. You can kind of see that in that picture, which then makes him more dependent on her. So that, didn't end up as a really healthy relationship between two of them. And their relationship, as long-term as it was, because none of the relationships of George Sand lasted this long. But they had a falling out with a domestic dispute when she felt that Chopin was taking the side of her daughter against her. So there's a lot of speculation that has gone on there also. He was able to keep a relationship through letter writing with her daughter, but with George Sand, he never wrote again. Now, the men in his life were many, and a few were good friends with whom he could share his heart, because this was one of those things, you wanted to be able to share who you are in this romantic era. Early on, he wrote many letters that were part of a book of letters that were compiled by a man named Henryk Opieński. The tone and the words of some of his letters seem a little odd to us today. For example, in the beginning, he had quite a few letters to a dear friend of his named Titus, and he would begin using all this love language, but that's how they wrote to each other during those times. Today, if you read those letters, you would probably think it's from one gay man to another, but that just wasn't the way it was back then. It was typical. One letter may begin For example, I received your last letter in which you sent me a kiss. And I mean, they're just full of flowery love language. He had comfort from his good Polish friends, and being with them always reminded him of being home. And the one friend that was with him to his death was Eugene Delacroix, the artist. You may have heard of him. There's a self-portrait of him there. In fact, Zamoyski says that Delacroix had a small picture of Chopin in his room that he kept to his dying day. Now, Chopin's music was paramount in his life. He preferred a Pleyel, if I'm saying that right, I've never heard it spoken, but a Pleyel piano, that's the name of the maker, because of the touch that it gave him. And he had one of these in every place that he lived, I think maybe except for one. And even if he had to wait a month or two for it to be delivered and pay an exorbitant cost to get it in, that's the piano that he wanted. And he was very, very particular about his pianos. And though he only gave only 30 large concerts in his life, he gave numerous small concerts to groups of people, most of whom he knew. He preferred to perform for only a few. One reason is that because he played so softly that people in the back of the hall wouldn't be able to hear him. Now, before I tell you about some of his music, you may find it interesting that he was known for his improvisations. He would play for 2 or more hours just to the delight of the people that were in the room. They absolutely loved it. He didn't have a strict teacher when he was young, so he had a certain freedom of movement with his hands and how he would make the piano sound. The love of his home country, Poland, also found a place in his music by his polonaises and mazurkas. The ones I listen to most are his nocturnes. And then there is the Sonata No. 2 in B flat minor that I think you'll recognize. So maybe you have heard Chopin, even if you didn't think that you had. People in today's world love to play his music and or listen to it. One pianist, Jean-François Antonioli, says in the journal Fanfare that his music has a way of creating an atmosphere. He says that sometimes Chopin speaks Polish and sometimes he speaks French. In an interesting newspaper article from 1960, Arthur Rubinstein said that early on in his musical career, he didn't regard Chopin with any interest at all. He just kind of dismissed him. But then he heard a 19-year-old play Chopin. And Rubinstein said he knew this is how Chopin should be played. And from that point onward, he included Chopin's music in his repertoire. I also have a friend who is, like Chopin, a self-taught and a beautiful pianist and organist. He says he is struck not only by the beauty, but by the deep sense of reflection. So I also thought this was a good time to check in with my Facebook friends and ask them if they've ever listened to or if they do listen to Chopin. I received 24 replies, and they ranged from, oh yes, I remember listening to him in the past